The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. He had served as a palace guard for 15 years, witnessing countless moments of royal protocol and tradition. His weathered hand smoothed the red fabric of his tunic while his mind wandered to the strange conversation he'd overheard the previous evening. Thomas had been stationed outside the Queen Consort's private quarters when he heard muffled voices through the heavy oak doors. The words were unclear, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. It wasn't unusual for important discussions to take place behind closed doors, but something about last night felt different. The way Camilla's voice had trembled, the hurried footsteps of her personal secretary, and the unusual number of phone calls that continued well past midnight all pointed to something significant brewing within the palace walls. As he made his way through the ornate corridors, Thomas noticed an unusual tension among the staff. The housekeepers whispered in hushed tones, their usual cheerful morning greetings replaced with worried glances. Even the head butler, normally composed and unflappable, seemed on edge as he directed the daily operations with more urgency than usual. The palace had always been a place of secrets, but Thomas had developed an instinct for sensing when those secrets were about to surface. His years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs, the way conversations stopped when certain people entered a room, how meetings were suddenly moved to more private locations, and the increased presence of security personnel in areas that were typically routine. What troubled Thomas most was the unusual request he'd received that morning. Instead of his regular post at the main entrance, he had been assigned to monitor the corridor leading to Camilla's private chambers. The assignment came directly from the head of security, delivered with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't a routine rotation. He was instructed to ensure complete privacy for the Queen Consort and to report any unusual activities immediately. As Thomas took his position outside Camilla's quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to become part of something much larger than a simple guard duty assignment. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he realized that his 15 years of loyal service had prepared him for this moment, though he had no idea what was about to unfold behind those imposing doors. The corridor was unusually quiet, with only the distant sound of footsteps echoing from other parts of the palace. Thomas stood at attention, his trained eyes scanning the hallway while his mind processed the morning's events. He had served the royal family with unwavering dedication, earning their trust through his discretion and professionalism. Today, that trust would be tested in ways he never could have imagined. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward noon, when Thomas heard the distinctive sound of Camilla's heels approaching from within her chambers. He straightened his posture, preparing for what he assumed would be a routine acknowledgement as she passed by. Instead, the footsteps stopped just behind the door, followed by a long moment of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Thomas had learned to distinguish between different types of silence during his years at the palace. There was the comfortable quiet of contentment, the tense stillness of concentration, and the heavy silence that preceded important announcements. This silence felt different. It carried the weight of decision, as if someone was gathering courage for an action that would change everything. The sound of the door handle turning broke the spell, and Thomas prepared himself for whatever was about to emerge from behind those doors. His training had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for the expression on Camilla's face as she appeared in the doorway. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by something he had never seen before, a mixture of determination, vulnerability, and what appeared to be relief. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the ornate corridor, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Thomas recognized this as one of those pivotal moments that would forever divide his life into before and after. The morning's tension, the whispered conversations, and the unusual assignment suddenly made sense as he realized he was about to become the keeper of a truth that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Camilla looked directly into Thomas's eyes, her gaze carrying a vulnerability he had never witnessed in any member of the royal family. The Queen Consort, who had always maintained an air of regal composure in public, now stood before him with tears threatening to spill down her carefully made-up cheeks. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a manila envelope against her chest, as if it contained the most precious and dangerous secret in the world. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about this family." The formality that usually characterized their interactions had completely disappeared, replaced by an urgency that made Thomas's heart race. He had served the royal household long enough to know that when protocol was abandoned, the situation was truly extraordinary. The corridor around them seemed to hold its breath as Camilla stepped closer, her eyes darting toward both ends of the hallway to ensure they were completely alone. The weight of her words settled over Thomas like a heavy blanket, and he found himself questioning whether he truly wanted to hear what she was about to reveal. His 15 years of service had been built on the foundation of not asking questions, simply following orders and maintaining discretion. "Ma'am, perhaps we should step inside your chambers," Thomas suggested, his training automatically prioritizing her safety and privacy. But Camilla shook her head, her grip tightening on the envelope. "No, Thomas. What I'm about to share with you cannot be said within these walls. Too many ears, too many eyes, too many people who would use this information for their own purposes." The implications of her words sent a chill down Thomas's spine. In all his years at the palace, he had never heard a member of the royal family express such distrust of their own household. The very institution he had sworn to protect suddenly felt fragile, as if it were built on secrets that could crumble at any moment. Camilla's usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "I've been carrying this burden alone for months," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But last night I received information that changes everything. The phone calls you might have heard, the meetings that ran late into the night, they were all connected to this." She held up the envelope, and Thomas could see her hands were no longer trembling. Whatever decision she had made had given her a new resolve. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast shadows across Camilla's face, highlighting the determination in her expression. Thomas realized he was witnessing a transformation. The queen consort was shedding the careful diplomatic mask she wore in public and revealing the woman underneath. It was both inspiring and terrifying to see someone he had always viewed as untouchable displaying such raw humanity. "Thomas, I chose you specifically because in 15 years, you have never once betrayed a confidence or spoken out of turn," Camilla said, her voice taking on a tone of deep respect. "Your loyalty to this family has been absolute, and that's why I'm trusting you with something that could destroy us all if it falls into the wrong hands." The weight of responsibility she was placing on his shoulders felt almost unbearable. As she spoke, Thomas began to understand that this wasn't just about palace gossip or minor scandals. The way Camilla's entire demeanor had changed, the careful timing of this conversation, and the obvious planning that had gone into this moment all pointed to something far more significant. He was about to become part of royal history, though he couldn't yet comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. The envelope in Camilla's hands seemed to pulse with importance, and Thomas found himself both drawn to and terrified of its contents. Whatever documents or photographs it contained had the power to change everything, and he was about to become one of the few people in the world who knew the truth. The responsibility was overwhelming, but his years of service had prepared him to shoulder whatever burden was about to be placed upon him. "Are you prepared to hear something that will challenge everything you believe about duty, loyalty, and the nature of the monarchy itself?" Camilla asked, her eyes searching Thomas's face for any sign of hesitation. The question hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized that his answer would define not only his future, but potentially the future of the institution he had devoted his life to serving. Thomas nodded slowly, his throat tight with anticipation as he gave Camilla his silent consent to continue. The queen consort took a deep breath and carefully opened the manila envelope, her fingers handling the contents with the reverence reserved for the most sacred artifacts. What she withdrew was not the official documents or photographs Thomas had expected, but a collection of handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "These letters," Camilla began, her voice thick with emotion, "were written by King Charles over 30 years ago, long before he became king, before our marriage, and before the world knew the truth about his relationship with Diana." The mention of Princess Diana's name in this context sent a shock through Thomas's system. Even years after her death, Diana remained a subject of intense public interest and speculation. Camilla untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, revealing pages of Charles's distinctive handwriting. What the world never knew, Thomas, is that Charles wrote these letters to me during his marriage to Diana, but they weren't love letters in the way people might assume. They were confessions, admissions of terrible guilt and regret about decisions that were made for him, not by him. The implications of her words began to dawn on Thomas as he realized the potential explosive nature of what she was revealing. The marriage to Diana, Camilla continued, her voice barely audible, was never Charles's choice. It was orchestrated by the palace, by advisors who believed they knew what was best for the monarchy. Charles was deeply in love with me. Yes, but he was also a young man caught between his heart and his duty. These letters reveal the agony he endured, knowing that his marriage to Diana would ultimately destroy her. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as Camilla's words painted a picture completely different from the public narrative that had dominated headlines for decades. The story the world had accepted of Charles as a callous husband who abandoned his beautiful young wife for his older mistress was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by something far more complex and tragic. In these letters, Charles describes meeting with palace officials who made it clear that his relationship with me had to end for the good of the monarchy, Camilla said, holding up one of the yellowed pages. He writes about being told that Diana was the perfect choice for a future queen, young, beautiful, from an appropriate family. But he also writes about the warning signs that everyone chose to ignore. The queen consort's hands shook as she continued. Charles knew Diana was struggling with emotional issues long before their marriage. He begged the palace advisors to delay the wedding, to give her more time, to consider the impact of forcing two incompatible people into a marriage for the sake of appearances. But he was told that backing out would damage the monarchy's reputation beyond repair. Thomas listened in stunned silence as decades of carefully constructed public relations narratives collapsed around him. The story of Charles and Diana's fairy tale wedding, broadcast to millions around the world, had been built on a foundation of coercion and ignored warning signs. The real tragedy wasn't just the failure of the marriage, but the systematic denial of obvious problems that could have been addressed. The most heartbreaking letter, Camilla whispered, pulling out a page that appeared more worn than the others, was written 3 months before Charles and Diana's wedding. He describes a conversation with Diana where she confided in him about her bulimia, her depression, and her fear that she wasn't ready for royal life. Charles immediately took this information to his advisors, begging them to postpone the wedding and get Diana the help she needed. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. If what Camilla was saying was true, then the palace hierarchy had knowingly proceeded with a wedding despite clear evidence that the bride was struggling with serious mental health issues. The human cost of that decision had played out in front of the entire world for over a decade, culminating in one of the most tragic stories in modern royal history. They told Charles that canceling the wedding so close to the date would be a disaster for the monarchy, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the burden she had carried alone for so long. They assured him that Diana's problems were just pre-wedding nerves that would resolve themselves once she settled into royal life. They were either incredibly naive or deliberately blind to the severity of her condition. As Thomas absorbed the magnitude of what he was hearing, he began to understand why Camilla had chosen to share this information now. These weren't just historical documents. They were evidence of institutional failures that had cost lives and destroyed reputations. The question that remained was what Camilla intended to do with this explosive truth, and why she had chosen him as her confidant in this moment of decision. Camilla carefully selected another letter from the bundle, this one bearing a date from just 6 months after Charles and Diana's wedding. "Thomas, this letter contains something that will shock you even more," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed truth. Charles writes about a private meeting he had with Diana where she begged him to help her leave the marriage. She told him she felt like she was drowning, that the constant media attention and royal expectations were destroying her mental health. The queen consort's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading excerpts from Charles's tortured correspondence. Diana came to Charles not as a betrayed wife, but as a desperate young woman asking for help from the only person who might understand the pressures she was facing. She didn't want to destroy the monarchy or create a scandal. She just wanted to escape, before the situation destroyed her completely. Thomas felt his understanding of one of the most famous marriages in history completely reshape itself as Camilla revealed these hidden truths. The public narrative of Charles as a cold, unfaithful husband and Diana as the innocent victim was being replaced by a far more complex story of two people trapped in impossible circumstances by institutional demands that prioritized appearance over human welfare. Charles took Diana's plea to the same advisors who had pushed for the marriage, Camilla explained, her voice growing more emotional with each revelation. He told them that continuing the charade would be cruel to Diana and ultimately more damaging to the royal family than an early, dignified separation. But once again, he was told that the monarchy couldn't survive the embarrassment of a failed royal marriage so soon after the fairy tale wedding. The implications of this revelation struck Thomas with devastating clarity. The palace machinery had not only forced two incompatible people into marriage, but had then trapped them in that marriage, despite clear evidence of the psychological damage it was causing. Diana's struggles with bulimia, depression, and self-harm had been known to the institution, but the decision had been made to prioritize public relations over human lives. The most tragic part, Camilla whispered, holding up a letter dated 2 years into the marriage, is that Charles and Diana actually developed a friendship during this period. They began to see each other as fellow prisoners of the system rather than enemies. Diana would often call Charles late at night not to fight or argue, but to talk to someone who understood the impossible pressures they both faced. This revelation completely contradicted the public perception of their relationship as one of constant conflict and mutual resentment. Instead, Camilla was describing two people who had found solidarity in their shared suffering, supporting each other even as the world painted them as adversaries. The real enemy wasn't each other, but the institutional framework that had created their impossible situation. Charles writes about conversations where he and Diana would discuss their dreams of what their lives might have been like if they had been allowed to marry for love instead of duty, Camilla continued, her voice breaking slightly. Diana told him about a teacher she had met before her engagement, someone who made her laugh and feel normal. Charles, of course, spoke about his feelings for me, but also about his genuine affection and concern for Diana as a person. The picture Camilla was painting was of two people who had been used as pawns in a larger game, their personal happiness sacrificed for the perceived stability of the monarchy. Thomas began to understand that the real tragedy wasn't just the failure of the marriage, but the way that failure had been deliberately prolonged and manipulated by advisors who cared more about avoiding scandal than protecting the people involved. The letters also reveal something else that has never been made public, Camilla said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Diana knew about my relationship with Charles from very early in their marriage, and she wasn't angry about it. She was actually relieved. She told Charles that knowing he had someone who truly loved him made her feel less guilty about her own inability to be the wife he needed. This revelation shattered Thomas's final assumptions about the royal triangle that had dominated headlines for decades. Instead of a bitter rivalry between two women fighting over the same man, Camilla was describing a situation where all three people had been victims of circumstances beyond their control, trying to find ways to survive and protect each other within an impossible system. The weight of these revelations was overwhelming, but Thomas could sense that Camilla had more to share. The careful way she was building her story, the strategic selection of letters, and the emotional intensity of her delivery all suggested that she was preparing him for an even more shocking truth that would put everything else in perspective. Camilla reached for a letter that appeared different from the others. Newer paper, darker ink, and Charles's handwriting showing signs of greater maturity and urgency. Thomas, this letter was written just 3 months before Diana's death in 1997, she said, her voice heavy with the weight of impending revelation. It contains information that, if made public at the time, would have prevented one of the greatest injustices in modern royal history. The Queen Consort's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, and Thomas could see that this particular piece of correspondence had been read many times, its creases worn from repeated handling. Charles writes here about a conversation he had with Diana just weeks before her final trip to Paris. She had called him in a state of panic, saying that she had discovered something about her security detail that frightened her. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of Camilla's words began to sink in. The circumstances surrounding Diana's death had been the subject of countless investigations, conspiracy theories, and public speculation. But the official verdict of accidental death had eventually been accepted by most of the world. Now Camilla was suggesting there had been information that was never made public. Diana told Charles that she had noticed irregularities in her protection schedule. Camilla continued, reading directly from the letter. Personnel changes that hadn't been explained to her. New security protocols that seemed designed to limit her movement rather than protect her. And most troubling, conversations she had overheard between her bodyguards that suggested they were reporting her activities to someone other than their official supervisors. The implications of these revelations were staggering. If Diana had been aware of problems with her security arrangements weeks before her death, why hadn't this information been part of the official investigations? Thomas realized he was hearing details that could potentially rewrite the history of one of the most scrutinized tragedies of the modern era. Charles immediately took Diana's concerns to his security team. Camilla explained, her voice growing more intense. But he was told that Diana's fears were the result of paranoia, brought on by media pressure and emotional instability. The security experts assured him that all protocols were standard and that Diana's protection was being handled according to established procedures. The pattern was becoming clear to Thomas. Once again, Diana's legitimate concerns had been dismissed as emotional overreaction by an institutional system that seemed determined to minimize her voice and agency. The same dismissive attitude that had trapped her in an unwanted marriage was now being applied to her fears about her personal safety. But Charles didn't accept those assurances. Camilla continued, revealing another layer of the tragedy. He secretly arranged for an independent security assessment through contacts he had developed during his military service. The preliminary report came back just 2 weeks before Diana's death, and its findings were deeply disturbing. Thomas held his breath as Camilla prepared to share what might be the most explosive revelation of all. The careful buildup of evidence, the systematic deconstruction of official narratives, and the emotional intensity of the moment all suggested that she was about to reveal something that could change public understanding of events that had shaped modern history. The independent security analysis found multiple vulnerabilities in Diana's protection arrangements, Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Communication gaps between different security agencies, unauthorized changes to established protocols, and most concerning, evidence that Diana's movements and plans were being shared with parties outside the official security structure. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If there had been known security vulnerabilities and evidence of unauthorized information sharing, then Diana's death might not have been the tragic accident that the world had accepted. The cover-up wasn't just about protecting reputations. It might have been about concealing institutional failures that had contributed to a preventable tragedy. Charles was preparing to present this information to the highest levels of government, Camilla revealed, holding up the final page of the letter. He had scheduled meetings with security officials for the week after Diana's return from Paris. He was going to demand a complete overhaul of her protection arrangements and a full investigation into the security breaches that had been identified. The timing was devastating in its implications. Charles had been trying to protect Diana, working behind the scenes to address the very security concerns that she had brought to his attention. But his efforts had been cut short by the tragedy in Paris, and the evidence he had been gathering had apparently been buried along with the official investigations that followed. Thomas realized that Camilla wasn't just sharing historical documents. She was revealing evidence of institutional failures and potential cover-ups that had never been made public. The question that remained was why she was choosing to reveal this information now, decades later, and what she intended to do with these explosive truths that could potentially rewrite royal history and challenge the official conclusions about one of the most significant events of the late 20th century. Camilla carefully returned the letters to the envelope, but Thomas could see there was more she needed to share. The weight of the revelations hung between them like a heavy fog, transforming the familiar palace corridor into a place where history was being rewritten in real time. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a new determination that suggested she had made a momentous decision. Thomas, what I've shared with you about the past is only part of why I called you here today, Camilla said, her composure returning as she shifted from historian to woman of action. Last night I received a phone call that changes everything. Someone has been investigating the same security irregularities that Charles had uncovered before Diana's death, and they've found new evidence that confirms his worst fears. The revelation that the investigation was ongoing, that new evidence had emerged decades later, sent Thomas's mind racing with possibilities. If there truly had been institutional failures or deliberate negligence in Diana's protection, then the implications went far beyond historical curiosity. There could be people still alive who bore responsibility for decisions that had contributed to her death. The person who called me is a former intelligence officer who worked on royal protection. Details in the 1990s, Camilla explained, her voice taking on an urgency that made Thomas understand the gravity of their situation. He's been carrying his own burden of guilt for 26 years, knowing that he had information about security vulnerabilities that he was ordered not to pursue. Now facing a serious illness, he's decided to come forward with everything he knows. The implications of this development struck Thomas with the force of revelation. A first-hand witness from within the security establishment was prepared to break decades of silence about potential institutional failures that had contributed to Diana's death. This wasn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This was testimony from someone who had been inside the system when the critical decisions were made. He told me that Charles's independent security assessment had been more accurate than anyone realized, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the burden she had been carrying alone. The vulnerabilities that were identified weren't just administrative oversights. They were the result of deliberate decisions made by people who wanted Diana's protection to be less comprehensive than it should have been. The suggestion that Diana's security had been deliberately compromised sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the temperature in the corridor. If this was true, then her death hadn't just been a tragic accident compounded by institutional incompetence. It had been the predictable result of decisions made by people who either didn't care about her safety or actively wanted her to be vulnerable. The intelligence officer has documents, communication records, and witness testimonies that were never included in the official investigations, Camilla revealed, each word dropping like a stone into still water. He's prepared to present this evidence to current authorities, but he wanted to warn the royal family first about what was coming. That's why he called me, because he knows I understand the personal cost of these revelations. Thomas began to understand the impossible position Camilla found herself in. On one hand, she had evidence that could potentially clear Charles and herself of decades of public blame for Diana's unhappiness and death. On the other hand, revealing this evidence would expose institutional failures and potential criminal negligence at the highest levels of the British establishment, creating a scandal that could destabilize the monarchy itself. I've spent months agonizing over what to do with this information, Camilla admitted, her vulnerability showing through her royal composure. Part of me wants to let the truth come out, to finally clear Charles's name and show the world that he tried to save Diana, not harm her. But another part of me fears what this revelation will do to William and Harry, who have spent their adult lives processing their grief based on an incomplete understanding of what really happened. The human dimension of the dilemma was heartbreaking to contemplate. Diana's sons had built their understanding of their parents' relationship and their mother's death on publicly available information that, according to Camilla's revelations, was fundamentally incomplete. Learning that their father had actually been trying to protect their mother, and that institutional failures had contributed to her death, would force them to completely reconstruct their understanding of their family history. There's also the question of what this revelation will do to public trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect the royal family, Camilla continued, articulating the broader implications of her dilemma. If people learn that security failures contributed to Diana's death, and that evidence of those failures was covered up for decades, how can anyone have confidence in the systems that are supposed to protect us now? Thomas realized that Camilla was facing one of the most difficult decisions imaginable, whether to prioritize personal vindication and historical truth over institutional stability and family peace. The weight of that decision explained the sleepless nights, the urgent phone calls, and the careful consideration that had led to this moment of revelation in the palace corridor. That's why I needed to share this with someone I trust completely, Camilla concluded, her eyes meeting Thomas's with an intensity that conveyed the full measure of the responsibility she was placing on his shoulders, because whatever decision I make about this information will affect not just my family, but the entire monarchy and the British people's faith in the institutions that govern their lives. Thomas stood in silence for several moments, processing the enormous weight of what Camilla had shared with him. The revelations had completely transformed his understanding of events he thought he knew, and now he found himself at the center of a decision that could reshape modern British history. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the wisdom earned through 15 years of faithful service to the crown. "Ma'am, in all my years serving this family, I've learned that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of our attempts to control it," Thomas said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. "The question isn't whether this information will become public. It's whether the royal family will be part of revealing it honorably, or whether they'll be caught unprepared when someone else forces their hand." Camilla nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Thomas's observation. The intelligence officer who had contacted her was dying, which meant he had nothing to lose by going public with his information. If the royal family didn't take control of the narrative, they would find themselves responding to revelations made by others, potentially in ways that were less favorable to their interests. "I keep thinking about Diana," Camilla admitted, her voice soft with genuine emotion. She spent her entire adult life being misunderstood, blamed for things that weren't her fault, and having her voice dismissed by people who thought they knew better. If this information can finally give her the vindication she deserves, don't I have an obligation to make sure it comes to light? Thomas could see that despite all the political and institutional considerations, Camilla's decision was ultimately being driven by her conscience and her desire to right a historical wrong. The woman who had been portrayed for decades as Diana's enemy was now fighting to restore Diana's reputation and reveal the truth about the circumstances that had led to her death. "There's something else to consider," Thomas said, his years of observing royal dynamics giving him insight into the broader implications. "Prince William and Prince Harry are both fathers now. They're raising children who will grow up hearing stories about their grandmother. Don't they deserve to know the complete truth about what happened to her, even if that truth is difficult to accept?" The mention of Diana's grandchildren seemed to crystallize something in Camilla's mind. The decision she was making wasn't just about the past. It was about the future and the kind of legacy Diana's family would inherit. If there was evidence that could honor Diana's memory and reveal the institutional failures that had contributed to her death, perhaps it was worth the risk to the monarchy's reputation. "I've made my decision," Camilla said with sudden clarity, her voice taking on the authority that came with her royal position. "I'm going to arrange a private meeting with William and Harry first. They deserve to hear this from family, not from newspaper headlines. Then, regardless of their reaction, I'm going to work with the intelligence officer to ensure this information is presented properly to the appropriate authorities." Thomas felt a profound respect for the courage Camilla was displaying. She was choosing truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and Diana's vindication over her own peace of mind. It was a decision that could potentially damage her own reputation and create chaos within the institution she had devoted her life to serving. But she was making it anyway because she believed it was right. "The irony isn't lost on me," Camilla continued with a sad smile. "For decades, people have accused me of destroying Diana's happiness. Now I find myself in the position of being the one who can restore her reputation and reveal the truth about how badly she was failed by the very institution that was supposed to protect her." As Thomas watched, Camilla transformed from a woman burdened by secrets into someone empowered by moral clarity. He understood that he was witnessing one of those rare moments when personal conscience triumphs over institutional pressure. The queen consort was choosing to risk everything she had worked to achieve in order to honor the memory of the woman the world believed she had wronged. "Thomas, I need you to arrange a secure communication with William and Harry," Camilla said, her voice now carrying the efficiency of someone who had moved from deliberation to action. "This conversation needs to happen within the week, before word of the intelligence officer's evidence starts to spread. And I need you to prepare yourself for the fact that once this information becomes public, life at the palace will never be the same again." As Thomas nodded his acceptance of his new responsibilities, he realized that his 15 years of faithful service had been preparing him for this moment. He had been chosen not just as a keeper of secrets, but as a witness to history and a guardian of truth. The hidden story of Diana's final years was about to emerge from the shadows, and Thomas understood that he would forever be remembered as the man who helped ensure that the truth finally came to light. The palace corridor, which had seemed so familiar that morning, now felt transformed into a place where history had been made. Thomas knew that future generations would judge whether Camilla's decision had been wise. But in this moment, he was proud to serve a woman who had chosen courage over comfort and truth over convenience. The hidden story that had remained buried for 26 years was finally about to be told, and the world would never see the royal family or the tragic story of Princess Diana in quite the same way again.